Almost ready. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a second. Some of you may remember Azam Nizamuddin, who has been here before and very well known, respected, and I think you're going to find this a really interesting morning. Azam is an attorney who does litigation primarily, and he's also recently retired from Loyola University professor in the theology department. I think you're going to really enjoy this morning, and I'm going to let him fix his coffee. But he's going to be talking this morning about the history of the Islam faith and how we got to where we are today. It's okay. Coffee's important.
Sorry.
Okay. So thank you for being here this morning. And turn it over to Nava.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming. My slideshow's going down without me. They're like our kids as they get older.
Can everyone hear okay?
Hello, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. No, I was saying that my slideshow was kind of going beyond me, and it's kind of like when your kids are older.
Yeah.
They're kind of teenagers. They kind of go do things without you. All right. Anyway, so I'm here to talk about Islam. I think the last time I was here, I think I've been here twice. I think the first time was like 2002.
Ooh.
And then after that, maybe 2006 or 7, probably. So it's been a long time. That means that you guys didn't like the last lecture. So you're like, we're not going to invite this guy back. It's a little interesting because I haven't done this in a while. And in the past few years, I've been focused so much more on the area of law and politics that I haven't done a lot of these 101s. I think also because so much has happened in the world, and people have been focused more on specific aspects that relate to the Muslim community as opposed to a general 101. So I think perhaps what we'll do is, I've got a lot of slides. I don't have to go through all of them, but I'll kind of give you an overview a little bit, and if you'd like to ask questions, usually my practice was that I give a presentation and then people ask questions at the end. But I think, given the nature of the subject matter, I'm open to having questions, so you can feel free to interrupt me and ask me questions in between. We'll kind of go from there. Okay, can you all see the screen?
No. I mean, the screen is there.
Oh, what happened? Oh, the projector died, I think. I don't see it. Something happened with the projector. There it goes.
Can't see it. Turn the light down. Lower some lights. Oh, it's more romantic.
It's warming up.
Yay. Oh, it's short too.
Okay. All right, I think we're ready to go, right? Okay, anyway, so I'll begin with the first question, which is, how should we understand religion? Well, other people's religion, that is. And I think most of us, particularly if we come from a religious perspective or even a non-religious perspective, we tend to understand other people's religion by and large by the media. And in the case of Islam, through the political establishment and the news media and the military establishment, the foreign policy establishment, which all have some aspect of state interest involved. And that becomes very problematic, I think, to understand, because as you know, religions, especially the world religions, much of the aspect of what they teach is about spirituality and being a good person and so forth. And all that gets lost pretty much when Islam is discussed. So I think you guys all know this, given the nature of Oak Park, that it's important how we approach religion and not approach it from a political foreign policy establishment. Now those discussions are useful to help understand the political aspect when you're a legislator making a foreign policy decision perhaps. But for everyday people, to me that's not really the central focus, because what happens is when you focus on the political and national security aspect of any religion or community, you wind up with things like this. You know, like, what are the common themes here? The common themes here from 1990, this is from, now the Atlantic, some of you probably read the Atlantic, and on occasion I'll read the Atlantic. It's supposed to be a substantive intellectual journal. And yet, here's the front page from 1990. 1990. And then, after, I think this picture was from Egypt, during the Arab Spring and so forth. So, you can see, almost 20 years later, you know, how the media continues to sort of show the fact that all Muslims, you know, they're just rage-engaging fanatics, you know, extremists. And these are the front page covers, okay? At prominent magazines. I mean, this isn't Fox News, right? Or something else. So, yeah. So, I mean, and why? It's because it's the focus is on the politics and the national security apparatus, right? And of course, you continue on and get this, right? The war on terror, September 11th, and so forth. And so, you know, instead, what we want to do is we want to sort of have a perspective of being grounded in facts and the context whenever we approach Islam, when we approach religions in general, and Islam in particular. Let's try to postpone assumption and judgments while maintaining a critical approach, which is very hard for most people, but we can do it. And looking at people and individuals from a specific cultural or religious background, knowing that it involves political, economic, cultural dynamics, which are always changing, and considering and assessing different perspectives and viewpoints without the necessary aspect to endorse or defend. You know, in other words, trying to really stay back and be as objective as possible, which I think we've really lost in this country for the past 10 years, unfortunately. But we have to bring that back somehow. And perhaps opportunities like these are those moments we can do that. All right. Remember, Islam is not monolithic, right? You have different people, different perspectives, from religious figures to activists to government officials to, you know, entertainers or sports legends and so on and so forth. You know, we're not only about one group of people all covered up or with long beards looking fanatical. Okay? You guys know some of these people? Does everyone know there? That's Keith Ellison. He's the Minnesota Attorney General. He's in the spotlight right now. Of course, there's Malcolm X. This is Lena Khan. She was the head of the FTC during the Biden administration. And very powerful, one of the most powerful figures of the Biden administration. She was going after all the big corporations to try to prevent them from exerting their influence in collective ways. And this is Hamza Yusuf down here, who was a very prominent Islamic scholar, American born and raised, very influential as well. But you guys don't hear these people generally. Okay, so another way to look at religion, aside from the political, foreign policy, political establishment, is looking at it from a devotional perspective. Now, this is something that Muslims themselves will often focus in on. But also your own lived experiences with your neighbors and community, you know, like how did you experience your Muslim neighbors and members of your Muslim community? And of course, there's the academic aspect of religion, which is what I focus on for most of my professional life, in which we look at religion from a theological perspective, doctrinal perspective, historical perspective, which is my favorite, but also art, architecture, sociology, and philosophy. These are all major disciplines in the world of academia because they all provide different contours of what we call religion, and in particular Islam. So you have the sociology of Islam, Islamic theology, Islamic philosophy, Islamic art, architecture. So this is nothing new because even in the Christian tradition, you look at and study and understand doctrines and perspectives through art. Right? And you can see the different aspects of Christian art that has evolved over time, from the medieval era on the left to the beginning of the Renaissance on the right. Right? Different ways of looking at Mary and the baby Jesus. They look so different, yet the perspectives are focused on those themes. The same thing in the Islamic tradition. You have this evolvement of ideas and so forth, because religions are not static, regardless of what you think. They change over time. Perhaps the central doctrines remain the same, but perspectives change. So we look at Quran, we look at the aspect of Quran as scripture, as a form of literary tradition, and you can see here different scripts. So even within the scriptural aspect, you have different scriptures in terms of how they're written. And there's a whole art to this as well, in different traditions over time. You can look at it like this. This is the kind of Quran that most Muslims will read, from right to left. This is the opening chapter. But then you can also look at it in this way, which is something that you find in many mosques and many architectural achievements as well. And you can even find it on important structures like the Dome of the Rock, where you see Quran writings here. These are some of the oldest Quranic writings in the world. They date back to the probably 790s, close to 800. And this is the actual rock, by the way. They call it the dome up here, the rock down there. And of course, there's the famous Taj Mahal you're familiar with, right? What does it have to do with the Quran? Anyone know?
Mughal era.
What's that?
From the Mughal era?
Yeah, right. It's from the Mughal era. And it was constructed under the regime of Shah Jahan. But what does that have to do with the Quran? Anybody know? Has anyone seen this live? Nobody? Okay. Well, if you go live, now you begin to see something. What's all this? What's all that? Quranic verses. There's 26 Quranic verses all over the outside and inside of the Taj Mahal. But you never hear about that, right? You never see that. Because it's kind of like, oh, it's a nice Indian Mughal thing, but it's Islamic. It's very Islamic. Not just from a political perspective, but Shah Jahan, being the emperor of South Asia, felt it was important that when he built this tomb that he had attached Quranic verses to that. And of course, in addition to architecture, in addition to various traditions, we also have poetry. Poetry became a significant way to both relate ideas, understand deep thoughts and perspectives, but also to engage in meditation. So certain poetry would be used as part of meditative rituals and so forth. And this is the opening line, opening verses, I should say, of Rumi's famous Mathnavi, or the couplets. And he basically begins by talking about the human condition. Listen to the reed how it tells a tale complaining of separation. Ever since I was parted from the reed bed, now this is the reed talking, my lament has caused men and women deep sorrow. I want someone, a bosom torn by separation, so that I can share this pain. In other words, I want to share this with someone who has gone through the same thing I've gone through. And everybody who's away from his origins longs for the time to be united with it. So what Rumi is doing is taking this flute called a reed and using that as a metaphor to describe the human condition. Just as, what's the origin of the reed? It's in a big pond or body of water. It's plucked out. It's sort of cleaned up, cut up, holes are put into it, and someone breathes into it. So the idea is that's the human condition. We're separated from the kingdom of God. Things happen to us, and then God breathes His Spirit in, and it comes to life. But it's a very sort of, a very kind of a sound that is kind of a wail. So it's a very sad sound, and that's the human condition. It's very interesting how I said that. And the last line talked about everybody who's away from his origins longs for the time to be united with it. So that is both a metaphor for the human condition, but also for his condition. Because Rumi is from what today constitutes either Afghanistan or the borders of Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And he had to leave, his family left, because the Mongols were coming in and conquering those territories. He goes to the Middle East and winds up in what today is central Turkey, in the city of Konya, where he sets up his schools and teachings and has hundreds of students and so forth. So he too longs the time when he was away from his home. Okay, so these are the basic sort of aspects of the Islamic worldview. This is the Islam 101 part of the presentation, which is the fact that the central figure in Islam is God. Everything centers around God. The worship is about God. The focus is on God. The reading of the Quran, which is about God, and so forth. And the God in Islam is basically similar to the God in Christianity and Judaism, particularly in terms of the Trinity. It's the Father aspect. And Tawheed is the central pillar and concept, which is God is one. It's a personal God, the supreme being in the United States, the creator of the universe, and so forth. And typically people understand it through these attributes, such as the most merciful, the most gracious, the most holiest of things, the most knowledgeable, the most knowing. And these are known as the attributes of God. And there's like several, almost 120 of them, but the 99 are the most popular that people often recite throughout their day or as part of their meditative practices. The second most important principle is this world is not the end, that there is something else at the end of this life. And it goes by different names, the hereafter, the afterlife, paradise or hell, and so on and so forth. And these really relate to what we call in religion eschatology. And this is Islamic eschatology. The concept of that what we do here matters, and there is a reckoning at the end of all this. And then the question becomes, how do we know? How do we know about God, and how do we know about this other reality called the hereafter or the afterlife? And there's two ways to know, generally. And that is through knowledge, through the form of scripture, or certain personalities that tell us so. Right? There's certain people who just tell us. And those people are called prophets. And you know about prophets. They're found in the Old Testament, they're found in the New Testament. And these prophets kind of bring wisdom, teachings, and they serve as role models for us to live. So in the case of Islam, the biblical prophets are part of that tradition, but also it culminates in the personality of a guy by the name of Muhammad, who lived in the late 6th and early 7th century. And his life and teachings become the paradigm of how people lived, how Muslims lived throughout their lives. So you got prophets, and then you got scripture, right? And in the Islamic tradition, scripture is not limited to the Quran, but includes the Old and New Testament and the Torah, but they're deemed to be superseded by the Quran. So that's when Muslims rely on the Quran solely. And yeah, so the prophetic teachings and the Quranic verses. The Quranic verses are used both as part of ritual prayer, as guidance, as law, as theological principles, and stories that serve as guidance and examples of prophets and Abel. In addition to the central two themes of God and the hereafter, knowledge, and then you have the idea of people and communities and what is a human being. The human being is both a physical and a spiritual being, not only a physical. It's spiritual because it has things such as what we call the soul or the spirit. And the community is important because it represents both those who are believers and those who are not believers. Now, what's interesting about Islam is because in the trajectory of history it comes after Christianity and Judaism, Islam makes a place for Christians and Jews within society. That's kind of the unique aspect of it. And you see this playing out in history quite a bit. So the people who are part of the body of believers are known as the Ummah. And then the people who namely are Christians and Jews are called the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book. Now, in history, sometimes other people have included as part of the people of the book, based upon certain interpretations. For example, in India, Shah Jahan, his scholars included Hindus as part of the people of the book. And that's important because it's this concept that Christians and Jews are part of the community, but designated as the people of the book, that Christians and Jews have always lived within Islamic boundaries, within the Islamic states. They always have, even today. That wasn't always the case with Europe prior to the 20th century. Now, we can get into also different sects of Islam, but that's going to take us a lot of time. But the two main branches are Sunnis and Shias, as you know. You probably heard of Sunnis and Shias. We can go into later on about that. A lot of talk, particularly after September 11th, I remember questions always came up was, what about war, what about war, what about violence, et cetera, and so forth. The idea of warfare is heavily discussed by various scholars in history, laying out principles of what's called just war theory, and when is it appropriate, when it is not appropriate, what are the rules of warfare. And that's usually because those are decisions for states, governments. It's not for individual Muslims to kind of decide to do, historically speaking. Okay, so this is basically the basic principles of the faith, or what we would call the creed, belief. So what's your belief system? What do you believe in? These are it. You believe in God, you believe in angels, you believe in the prophets, you believe in scriptures, the hereafter, divine destiny. Yeah?
Quick question. When you were referring to war, I seem to recall that some people interpret, I guess it's jihad, as actual war as we normally conceptualize it in the physical world. Two sides trying to kill each other and so on, but that others construe it as a war within the individual, within the soul, between, I don't know, perhaps good and evil tendencies or things of that nature.
Yeah.
Is that true, or am I?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's exactly right. So literally jihad, if you're referring to the term jihad that's always used, literally means struggle. And from a political, military perspective, it means warfare. And then from a spiritual, individual perspective, it means struggling against the soul. So fighting the bad tendencies, the tendencies to, commit sin or do things that hurt you. So there's both kinds. There's no question jihad also has a military aspect. Like I said, when the Islamic Empire forms initially, the jihad was a principle that the empire used to conquer territories. Yeah. But like I said, that's for governments and states to engage in. Individuals don't necessarily engage in jihad per se. They engage in personal jihad, which is trying to get up early in the morning like I did at 6 a.m. and doing prayers, for example, which is always a struggle. Anyway, continue on. So these are the main principles of belief, meaning this is something that you have to believe in to be a Muslim, basically. I think I already touched upon the first 5. The other one is what's called divine destiny, meaning that God has destined all these things for you. Now, this, of course, is the biggest tension in religions, which is the idea of predestination versus divine will, free will, and this is always continuing on. Even in the Islamic tradition, you have various schools of thought about it. Those who pushed the predestinarian divine will aspect much more affirmatively, as opposed to the free will thinkers that pushed their arguments. Islam sort of fell ultimately somewhere in between, which is God, because the reason predestination is so important is because you have to give God the idea of omnipotence, that God has to be omnipotent to be a God. Otherwise, what's the point? On the other hand, we do make choices as human beings. I can get up and not pray. I can get up, I don't have to come to this lecture. I can stay home and just sleep in. So those are choices I make, so clearly I have that ability. But the idea is that within a certain realm of reality, human beings have that free will and choice. But generally, everything that happens, like as I'm driving here, I could have gotten into an accident. Something could have happened that prevented me beyond my control, and that's where sort of God comes in. Right? So that's the sort of tension typically that Muslim theological schools have wrestled with for 1,000 years. Okay. Then you have something called, often known as, you've probably heard, called the 5 pillars of Islam. These pillars are really, in effect, the practices or the duties. These are the things you have to engage in physically. Okay? And of course, the most important is what we call the testimony of faith that you do during your prayers. The 5 canonical prayers daily, your charity, your fasting in Ramadan, by the way, which is coming up soon. Ramadan starts in about a month. And of course, during your lifetime, you have to make a pilgrimage to Mecca once in your life, if you're able to do so. Now it's so much easier because the Saudis have turned the Hajj into a fancy travel resort. So now you have travel packages.
Don't forget expensive.
Yeah, it's really expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, how much is it now? Like 20,000? 20,000 a package to go. It's absurd. But that's VIP, which means you get everything closer to the
That's
main area.
glamping.
Yeah. Okay. What time is it right now? What time are we going to?
We go to 9:45, and usually there's questions for the end. 10:45, I'm sorry.
10:45? Oh, so I have a half hour. Okay. So because Ramadan's coming, I'll mention a little bit about Ramadan real quick. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I know somebody like, okay, but what about women in jihad? Come on, tell us. All right. Okay, so the prescription or command for fasting is from the Quran, verse 183, chapter 2, which is, fasting is prescribed upon you as it was prescribed for those before you. Meaning, Christians and Jews also fasted. Okay, so this tradition of fasting is really nothing new. You all know about this, right? It's something that is found in our traditions here, whether it's Moses used to go into the mountains to sort of go into a period of retreat and fast for 40 days. The Buddha did the same. He sort of left his life of luxury and power and just kind of abandoned everything and began periods of fasts. And of course, Jesus as well is known for his fast and so forth. So the idea of fast is sort of giving up things for the sake of God, so you can sort of focus and become a better person, and also improve yourself. So that's where it comes in. What makes this fast as interesting is that this isn't an intermittent fast. An intermittent fast, which has now become popular, where you fast from, like, I don't know, 9 to 5 or whatever time period you want to do. This is a fast where you abstain from food and water and any sexual relations from dawn to dusk for 30 consecutive days, about 29 to 30 depending on the sighting of the moon. And this changes throughout the year because the Islamic calendar is shorter than the Gregorian calendar. So when you compare it to here, it moves back 11 days. So this year it's going to start February 18th, which is great because the fasts are really short.
Short days. Short days.
They're like 12 to 14 hours, and we can handle that. It's those 18-hour ones that are really tough in the summer. Whew. All right. But the issue about Ramadan, from a spiritual perspective, is not simply about abstaining from food and water. And there's very important theologians who've discussed this in depth, which is the idea of fasting. The month of Ramadan is reformation, self-reformation. It's supposed to make you a better believer, a stronger believer, and a better person. That's why there's a very famous phrase attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, who said, many people fast, but gain nothing from it except simply hunger. Meaning, they're just kind of doing the exact same thing they did during the rest of the year, but they're just starving a little bit more during the day. That's it. And the point there is that that's not really the purpose behind it. And this is a sort of a teaching moment for Muslims themselves, which is, look, you're supposed to really, change as a person and become a better person and avoid all this sort of crazy distractions that we're facing throughout the world, to focus on the bigger picture of what's coming ahead, what the next life is going to be for you if you don't shape up. And also just the crazy distractions that we have, right? This is pretty much the modern dilemma, isn't it right here? Right here? On the phone, driving, and sipping your coffee. Right, that's pretty much. And the radio probably now too. As opposed to just kind of staying back and reflecting on, what really should be the purposes of life. Consuming, and now it's even worse, right? With our generation, it wasn't that bad. The only thing we had was maybe TV or the radio. But today, people have social media and that stupid iPhone that is constantly, within our grasp, constantly allowing us to focus on this instead of that. So that's the idea, is that you sort of turn everything off for a period of roughly a month to kind of bring you back to where you really belong, what your essence is and so forth. The famous theologian, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, very famous, important thinker, wrote this massive tome, a 40-volume piece of work that took him about 10 years during his period of retreat to write. And he basically did an Islam A to Z of living, both in terms of practice, but practicalities, how to live, how to get married, how to engage in social relations with people, how to engage in economic relations, everything, A to Z. And one of those things he talks about is a chapter on fasting, in which he says, look, fasting is not just one thing. It has different levels, and he sort of creates 3 levels of fasting. The ordinary fast, which is what I meant to you, which is what I said to you earlier, which is you basically abstain from food and water and drink from dawn to dusk. That's your ordinary fast. And as long as you do that, you're fine. But for Ghazali, you have to go beyond that and engage in a special fast too, which is guarding one's speech and your actions and thoughts from harming other people and yourself. So if you had a tendency to use a lot of profanity, this is the time to cut it down. Or anything else. But then Ghazali goes beyond that and says, well, that's great. You're not harming people, you're being quieter, you're not saying offensive things to your family or friends or whoever. You're watching what you say, what you're watching your tongue, besides the abstaining from food and water. But also, there's a 3rd level of fasting, which is the fasting of the heart, where your heart is focused on nothing but God throughout that day. Now that's a lot harder, particularly if you're engaging in working and taking care of kids and so on and so forth, but that's his sort of next level, what we call the elite, fasting of the elite. Most of us probably can't do that, but it's a worthwhile goal to have. Anyway, the point is that there's different understandings of the idea of fasting. By the way, this idea of these levels applies to different areas of Muslim worship, whether it's fasting, charity, or worship. Okay, so just to give you an example, you can look at it from a modern and traditional perspective. Okay, traditional perspective. Actually, these are switched around. Should be the other way around. Anyway, but when you have no food, no drink, or marital relations, it's kind of like skipping meals but consuming distractions. When Ghazali is telling us to avoid harmful speeches and action, today it would mean fasting from gossip, negativity, excess digital noise. So perhaps you can have, a lot of kids say, well, we're going to have a no phone on Tuesday, right? Like you avoid using the phone on a certain day, or avoiding social media on a certain day. So that would be like that. So avoiding YouTube, for example, maybe, for me, because I'm always watching all these different, programs on YouTube. Fasting the heart, complete focus on God. So today that would be detachment of your ego and materialism and comparisons. Like, oh, how come they have this and I don't have that, right? That sort of level of comparison and vying for wealth and money as opposed to focusing on God. Okay, so that kind of takes out the Ramadan aspect, I think. At the end of the day, the issue here is, you go from this idea of where you are busy, running around, not really focused on where you should be, to cleaning up the idea. So fasting is kind of like our hearts become so entangled with distraction. It's kind of like your heart is basically trying to clean that up, and fasting is the garden's shears. It kind of helps you to kind of clean up, organize, and focus on where you really should be and where you belong. Okay? All right, now, so how did all this develop? Like, how does Ghazali, 400 or 500 years later after the forming of Islam, become who he is, and how does he begin to have these institutions and participate in these institutions? It's because you have this group that develops called these scholars, okay? And they're known as the ulama. Ulama comes from the word alim, which means scholar. So relatively soon, within a generation after the demise of the Prophet Muhammad, you have these people developing and learning and spreading these teachings out. And they become a class, basically an intellectual class. And they get hired by the state. Institutions are built called madrasas, which are colleges of law and learning, where then within 200 years you have theologians, philosophers, and lawyers. Lawyers meaning not lawyers like me, but lawyers who engage in the interpretation of scripture to give legal opinions about all kinds of matters. And this becomes an entire sort of institution of learning, which spreads out all over the world. And that's how the teachings of Islam spread. And as a result of that, you have these different subject matters that develop within the Islamic intellectual sphere. Islamic law, sometimes known as Sharia or fiqh, Islamic ethics, Islamic theology, which I touched about before, Islamic mysticism. You've probably heard the word Sufism quite a bit. Sufism is one aspect of Islamic teachings and practice, known as mysticism within the overall rubric of religion. And of course, Islamic philosophy. And here I mentioned two AVs because I ran out of space. It refers to two very important scholars called Avicenna. So if you know a little bit about European history, you know about Avicenna, who was a very important figure who really became a major source of medicine and surgery for several hundred years, which was copied by Europeans really up until the 17th, 18th century, but also a philosopher, a very important philosopher. And the other one is a guy by the name of Averroes from Spain, Muslim Spain, Andalusia, known as Ibn Rushd, and who was very important in transmitting the knowledge of Aristotle. So what the Muslims did in the 800s, the period roughly about 780s to about 850, they conquered Persia. Now, interestingly enough, they conquered the Sassanid Empire, which is a Persian empire. When they did so, they came across all these libraries of ancient Greek texts, and these were in Greek. So what the Muslims did was they hired translators to translate all of this Greek ancient knowledge into Arabic within really under 100 years. So all of Aristotle's works were translated into Arabic. Most of Plato's work was translated into Arabic, along with all these other areas of astronomy and medicine and so forth. So all this incredible Greek knowledge. And that knowledge is there for centuries in Baghdad, ultimately into other areas, Egypt, North Africa, and it winds up through Spain. So by the time, when you go from the 800s to the 1200s, it's in Spain because the Muslims had conquered southern Spain and controlled it for 800 years. Well, about 600 years, but they lived there about 800 years. So during the 1200s, you had this incredible period of what's known as the Convencia, which is you have all these Muslims, Jews, and Christians studying, working together, living together, in a very similar to the way the U.S. is today. At least it was until a few years ago. Exactly a year ago. All these scholars developed. So you may have, if you know your Jewish history a little bit, there's a very famous philosopher called Maimonides. Maimonides lives in the same period from Muslim Spain. He too develops in this area. Ibn Rushd, Averroes is from that period, and others. And Averroes took the Arabic translations of Aristotle and began writing books about them, commenting about them, studying them. And that knowledge went ultimately into Latin Christendom, so that the teacher of Thomas Aquinas was using Averroes' Arabic texts, which that were translated to Latin, to teach little Thomas Aristotle. And as you know, what's important about Thomas Aquinas is he's considered the expert on Aristotle, but it wouldn't have happened without Averroes, who's known in the Latin West as the commentator. What's he commenting on? Aristotle. So I'm just saying that there's this entire incredible system of intellectual history that very few people know about. Muslim scholars know about this, of course. Learned Muslims know about them. But even the common person may not know his depth about what I just said about Averroes, for example. But certainly people in Europe and America, because a lot of it has been elided out, completely elided out. And there's various reasons for that, but at the end of the day, the knowledge that Europeans took from Islam has never been attributed back to Islam. So if there was something such as intellectual property back in the 12th, 13th century, there'd be a lot of lawsuits going on. In any event, so it's...
Thank you for saving us from our dark ages.
Yeah, exactly. You know what's interesting is that I was just reading about that. Like when we studied history, right, we always read this, there's this period of, you have Greek thought, right, ancient Greece, then the Romans come in, and then the barbarians kind of destroy Rome, and then there's a period of dark ages. It just happens to be from the 7th century to the 14th century. And then you have this period of Renaissance, and then you have, the Enlightenment, and then you have industrialization. What happens between that period of dark ages? What's going on? Well, that's the rise of Islam, where Islam is basically, the Muslim world is at the peak of knowledge and power. In Baghdad, in Egypt, but also in Muslim Spain, in places like Sevilla, Cordova, and later on in Mongol India, and also Ottoman history, Istanbul. This entire period is not the Dark Ages at all. It's like a period of enlightenment for the Muslim world. But it's interesting that historians in the 19th century and 20th century that taught everybody Western Civ and so forth, they called it the Dark Ages, which is very odd. Because especially in this period of Muslim Spain from, like, say, the 10th to the 14th century, there wasn't anything dark about that period. It was Muslims, Christians, Jews learning together and studying, living next to one another. There's always battle. I don't want to make this into a sort of a period that everybody was just happy and feasting together, but it was relatively, given the history of that period of time, it was a pretty calm and good period of people cooperating, getting together. Okay, really quickly on the difference between Shias and Sunnis, because people always ask about that. So there's a difference between what I said was the Sunni community and the Shia community. Sunnis are approximately, depends on your figures, but anywhere between 85 to 90% of the Muslim world. Shias are about 10 to 15%. There's different branches within Shiism, by the way, okay? And the issue arises really over the succession to the Prophet Muhammad. So it starts early on. It's unlike the Protestant Reformation, which occurs 1,000 years later. The dispute within Islam begins really early. As soon as the Prophet dies, the question is who should succeed him? And to simplify this, the main difference was, should it be experienced people from his tribe who were his companions? Should they be the next successors to the Prophet Muhammad? Or should it be a member of his family? Okay. And there's a majority said we'll just go with the first group, which is the people who were with him during his initial period in his mission and his teachings and his wars and so forth, versus his cousin, son-in-law named Ali. And a group felt that Ali, who was a very close companion of his, was related to him, plus he was a very just figure, he should have been the next successor. Instead, you had a period of other successors, namely 3 guys, who succeeded the Prophet Muhammad. But by that time, you begin to see a lot of disunity. Finally, Ali does win, but then there's a civil war between Ali and the people who had succeeded the others. And that's where you begin this breakdown. However, this initial political dispute ultimately becomes a theological dispute as well. And what I mean by theology is, the question becomes, who is the rightful heir to the Prophet Muhammad in terms of the political leadership of the Muslim community? But also, who should be interpreting the sources on behalf of the Muslim community? And this becomes a big dispute as well. So, for example, in the law here in the United States, who should interpret the Constitution? Should it be the president? No. Or should it be Congress? Well, in a very important decision called Marbury versus Madison, Justice Marshall determined, and the Supreme Court determined, it should be the Supreme Court. It should be the final interpreter of the U.S. Constitution, right? So that occurs a couple of decades after the founding of the Republic. This dispute is ongoing. Actually, our dispute is ongoing too, because now the president thinks he should be interpreting the Constitution. But the Shia community felt that people who are the families of the Prophet Muhammad, like his descendants, have a spiritual aspect to them that's connected to him and God, that they are and should be the final arbiters of the sacred sources. So Ali and his successors, Hassan and Hussein and others and so forth. And ultimately you have this success, this leadership over the course of several generations, and there's about 12 of them. And they're called the 12 Imams. And these 12 Imams are the ones who become very famous in the Shia tradition, and people look into their teachings and so forth. And they're kind of like saints in Catholicism. Whereas the Muslim community said, no, it's anybody who's a scholar, anybody who's trained, that has the requisite knowledge, but also the ability to have followers in schools, they should be followed. So it's kind of like a little more ambiguous and a little bit spread out. Sunnis ultimately win because they're the ones who take over the power of the various Muslim communities throughout the world. Although there have been Shiite empires too. The 2 biggest Shiite empires were the Fatimids in Egypt in the middle of the 900s, and later on the Safavid, who controlled Iran. So you probably know that today Iran is heavily Shiite, right? That wasn't always the case. That occurred in, I want to say, the 15th century. No, 16th century, because a Shiite state came into power that converted Iranians into Shias. Because Ghazali, who I mentioned earlier, was from Iran. He's a Persian scholar. He's Sunni, hardcore Sunni. So Iran was not always Shiite. It became so in the 16th century, when the head of state, kind of like, you know how like Henry VIII decides that he's now going to be the head of the church, right, with his break from Rome. That's kind of like what this Shah Ismail did. Shah Ismail said, you know what, from now henceforth we will now subscribe to the Shiite branch of Islam. And ever since then it has been, so it's kind of interesting actually. Anyway, I won't belabor you with any more of that. So really quick on the issue of history, this is a quick timeline. Okay, we begin with always the Prophet Muhammad's life, then what's called the period of the rightly guided caliphs. This is a sort of appellation that was applied to them, meaning that these are the right guys that we should have had and they were okay. And that lasts a few decades. And then finally you have a sort of monarchy takeover, if you will, a dynasty for the first time in 680. And this is known as the Umayyad Empire. The Umayyad Empire removes its capital from Medina, which was during this period, to Damascus. So that's why Damascus becomes real famous, because it becomes the head of the Umayyad Empire. And then also, there's a second Umayyad Empire in Spain. Okay, they go to North Africa and ultimately set up camp out just beyond Morocco, what today's Morocco, across the Straits of Gibraltar, and establish a caliphate there too. And then after the Umayyads are overthrown by the Abbasids take over at 750 and they last about 1258. Now, these dates, you have to take them with a little bit of grain of salt in the sense that by the period 1000, the Abbasids had lost a lot of their territories and regional powers rose. But the 1258 date is important because that's the date the Mongols came in, sacked Baghdad, and destroyed Baghdad. Thousands were killed and so forth, and that pretty much ended that empire. But this is also known, sometimes the scholars and historians call this period the golden age of Islam. This is with Harun al-Rashid, the Arabian Nights sagas and stories, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, all that stuff that we saw in the 1940s coming out of Hollywood. This is a map of the Umayyads, as you can see. That's pretty amazing that just in a century, they conquered a lot of territories in different periods, places, Baghdad here, Damascus here. And this is Spain here. And they're all the way to Afghanistan, into what's today Pakistan. And then the Abbasids were able to maintain and stretch out a little bit more throughout the world here. So these are what we call the central lands of Islam here. Conquering these territories, North Africa, Spain, into a little bit of the Anatolian Peninsula, up until India, all the way out here. And this is also where you begin to see the Turks coming from this area here into the Middle East. The Turks. Today, Turkey's right here, right? Right there. Well, how the heck did they get from here to there? Yeah, it was a period of migration like this. Like that. Here we go. This is the first Turkish empire known as the Seljuk Sultanate. And as you can see, they come up from Central Asia. They're basically the cousins of the Mongols, and they fought the Mongols, and then they kept on getting beat up. So they said, let's go down here and see if we can get some pasture for our flocks and animals, and they did, and then they started beating up other people, other Muslims here. So they become huge. It's during the Seljuk Sultanate that Al-Ghazali is writing and teaching. So it's a very important time intellectually as well. A lot of poets and so forth. And you got the Fatimids here in Egypt, the other empire. You got the Byzantines, and the Seljuk Turks are the ones who are beating up the Byzantines. There's a very famous battle that occurs here, right about here, called the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which opens up the borders of the Byzantine empires, and they just keep on going westward. And this is where Rumi winds up here too, by the way. Okay. And then you have the collapse of the Abbasid dynasty. What's replacing them? The Mongols. They're coming from here. Whoops. They're coming from here, from western China. And there's different branches of the Mongols, by the way. A lot of people don't know this. The ones that take over what today is Russia and Ukraine and all that, they're called the Golden Horde. And then the ones that take over the Muslim, formerly the Abbasid period, the Muslims of Persia, of what's today Central Asia, up until Iraq and so forth, that's called the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate, not Illinois, don't confuse that, it's not Illinois. The Ilkhanate, and then you have others. So there's different branches of the descendants of the Mongols that carve up massive territories of the world. Huge, one of the largest empires in history. Okay, but then we don't go, Islam could have gone away here at this point. The Mongols could have just eradicated it, but they got stopped. By the way, the Mongols get stopped for the first time. They had their first defeat right here. In 1262, just in what was called Palestine, by a new dynasty that crops up, eventually takes over the area of Palestine, Syria, and Egypt, called the Mamluks. The Mamluks stopped the Mongols. First time in history, like, man, who are these guys that beat up the Mongols? Anyway, they get stopped, and that's why eventually the Mongols in this area, Ilkhanate, and some of these, they convert to Islam. Oh wow, that's fast. Okay, sorry guys. So really quick, here's the Ottomans. As you can see, huge territories, 600 years. The Mongols are here. They pretty much controlled all of what we call today South Asia for long periods of time. Here are some images from the Moguls. Ottoman is the Blue Mosque of Turkey. Inside the Blue Mosque of Turkey, you have a minaret. It's unbelievable. The Dome of Baja Palace, which was built in the 19th century to become more European. Then you have the period of European colonization. As you can see, the French in North Africa from 1830 to 1960. Napoleon invasion of 1798. The British in South Asia, really this should be 1750 to 1947. The Dutch in the 1700s, they controlled what's today Malaysia and Indonesia. And then, of course, the Italians in Libya. And it's because of the European colonization of the Muslim world after the collapse of these empires, this leads to a lot of problems. 90% of Muslim was conquered by European states, excluding Arabia, Persia, and Turkey. But what did? They overthrew native dynasties, dismantled traditional systems of education, enforced authoritarian rule, which still exists today in the form of dictatorship. So as long as he's our dictator, it's cool. But as soon as that dictator doesn't do what we want, he's gone. It's been playing out since the 50s. And they also train new elites in the new languages and methods of thought. All right, blah, blah, blah. This is, look at all the European settlements in India around the time of the Mongols, all here. British, French, Dutch, Danish, even the Danes got involved.
Portuguese.
Yeah, the Portuguese were the first ones to land in
The last
Goa.
to leave.
Right here, right there, Goa. Okay, then we get to the War on Terror, and blah, 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 blah. You don't know, you guys don't know about this. Okay, all this. Here's the message of what I was going to say about the last 20 years. People are like, well, it's Islam is the problem, Islam is the problem. Why are these groups that we mentioned earlier, why are they responding? They're responding not because of an interpretation of Islam only. It's because it's a political response to a political problem. Okay? Meaning, it's the invasions from outside, it's the authoritarian rule, the corruption, etc. And therefore, it's a political response. It's not a religious response. It's a failure of post-colonial states to share political and economic power with their people. The use of ruthless and unencumbered state violence and unaccountable injustices against Muslims. And of course, there is some aspect of religious interpretation here, which we can discuss later. Anyway, don't forget about Islamophobia. There's a lot of stuff that's been going on. This is important to know. Islamophobia is not just random bigotry or ethnic bigotry that you find here and there. It's a $50 million industry. Go plug in Fear Inc. 2.0 report, which was done by the Center for American Progress. They did a massive study, and they came up with this conclusion that all this negative stuff that's coming out about Islam in books and websites, it's not random. It's being funneled by major donors. You know how you have the Koch brothers doing all kinds of stuff, right? Well, you have a different branch that focuses on just targeting the Muslim community in the United States in particular, but generally. $50 million industry. Some of the key players are right here. Robert Spencer's a big one. He has a website called Jihad Watch, in which he just targets American Muslims. I think I was on there too when I ran for judge, and so forth, because they hate us. These people have access to the White House. Where's the thing I want to show? Look at these books that came out. Just right after 9/11. Wow, Europe slept. Oh, the Muslims are coming, the Muslims are coming. What the West needs to know, and we're going to tell you why, because you don't trust, anybody else. The truth about, all this stuff came out to just confuse and instill fear in American society. So it's not random, it's not, just sort of innocent in a way. It's being heavily funded and so forth. Anyway, that's all I have, you guys. So again, remember, religions are internally diverse as opposed to uniform. Religions evolve and change over time. And religious influence are embedded in all dimensions of culture as opposed to assumptions that religions exist in discrete, isolated, private context. In other words, it's more complex than you think, but always good to have more education. Thank you. Sorry, I had so much.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. Wish we had more time. Next week, we may or may not have a speaker. We thought we did, but there's been a little scheduling issue, and so we're working through that. So pay attention to your e-blast this week, because we will update this week. And are you
Come back.
we could look at it.
I could have came back into two.
Well, actually, you promised to maybe come back and talk about the American Constitution and separation of church and state and some of those interesting topics, so.
Yeah, I was gonna talk about the First Amendment clause, about how how it's evolved, how the Supreme Court has evolved the issue of separation of church and state, and the more important decisions that have come out in the past year, particularly under the Roberts Court, which is really important to know. So sometime we can do that.
Okay, we would love that. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Thanks, Joe, for coming, and
Thank you, guys.
do look at your e-blast this week. Thank you.